This is WBAI New York, 99.5 FM, and WBAI.org online. Stay tuned for Leonard Lopate at Large, and it is now 1 p.m.
Welcome to Leonard Lopate at Large. I'm Leonard Lopate. Christopher Miller, who now serves as a Ukraine correspondent for the Financial Times, has been embedded in Ukraine for 12 years. He was there on the ground when the first Russian missiles struck and troops stormed over the border in February 2022. Mr. Miller has written for a number of publications, including Politico and BuzzFeed News. He's been a correspondent for Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty in Kyiv. And his new book, The War Came to Us, Life and Death in Ukraine, it's published by Bloomsbury. It brings Christopher Miller to our show now. Welcome.
Thank you for having me, Leonard.
When you were a Peace Corps volunteer, weren't you hoping to get stationed somewhere on the African continent? How did you wind up being sent to the eastern Ukrainian city of Bakhmut instead?
Yeah, by fortunate accident. I had gone into a Peace Corps recruiter's office in Portland, Oregon, where I'm from, and said, I'm looking to spend a couple of years abroad. I've heard some good things about this program. They asked me where I'd like to go and showed me a map of the world that was split into 8 very large segments. And I said, I'd like to go here, someplace in sub-Saharan Africa, if it's possible. And they said, yeah, that might be possible. Some months went by, and they gave me a call and said, how about we send you to Eastern Europe instead? And I was open for an adventure abroad and didn't really mind where I went. I didn't have any affinity to anywhere in Africa, and I certainly didn't at the time in Ukraine either. But it was an interesting enough place for me to say yes to, and I agreed to go. And just a few weeks later, I ended up in Kiev, where I studied Russian and a little bit of Ukrainian for a few months before being dispatched to the city of Bakhmut, just a few hours from the Russian border.
It was called Artemivsk at the time. Which is weird. So many of these places have more than one name.
Yeah, and they have interesting stories behind them too. So Bakhmut, which is what the city is called today, is the original historical name of this place that was actually founded way back in 1571, and it was only named Artyomsk at the start of the Soviet Union, when they named the city and several other cities across the Union after Soviet heroes and Bolshevik heroes. So Artyom, or known by the Bolsheviks as Comrade Artyom, was a close ally of Joseph Stalin. And so they named several cities and towns, various versions of his name. Artyomovsk was what Bakhmut was renamed. There were several towns called Artemivsky, and so forth and so on. So when I arrived, it was called Artyomovsk.
Well, you were just 25 years old at the time, and the town had been struck hard by the economic downturn following the collapse of the Soviet Union. But you say you became hooked on the place. Why? Yeah,
it was quiet. It was simple. Nothing was at least outwardly particularly complicated. It took a little while for me to figure out just how complicated and complex the language and the culture and the politics were. But when I arrived there, I found a very quiet city of a little bit more than 70,000 people. I felt very much like an outsider for the first couple of months. I didn't speak Russian yet very well, and that was the predominant language there. But it was, essentially sink or swim. So I had to learn to do it or not. And so I sort of, forced myself to learn the language quickly. I got a couple of tutors. I was studying about 5 or 6 hours a day, and then also assigned work at the Central Library, and I helped out the central government with some development programs as well. And everybody, very quickly welcomed me in, and they were just as interested in this lone American who was living in this far-off place as I was in my new, at the time, a little bit of a strange town. But it felt like home very quickly. I think by the end of the summer, I had gotten to know everybody in my apartment building on a first name basis. I had a favorite vendor at the market who sold me produce. I had another one who sold me meat. I had another one for eggs. And, everywhere I went, because I was the only American living in this small place, everybody knew me, even if I didn't know them. And I was invited into a lot of kitchens and homes. And it just, became this really incredibly welcoming place that felt at that point already like a second home.
But can it get a little confusing? Many of the places and people's names have different spellings. President Zelensky's name is often spelled with 2 Y's at the end. Is that just when they're written in Western languages?
Yeah, yes and no.
And then the capital, the capital K-I-E-V and K-Y-I-V.
Yeah, so at least these are Russian and Ukrainian transliterations. So in Russian, we would say and we would write out Kiev as K-I-E-V, and that was for many years the accepted English spelling of the capital. But there has been a push by the Ukrainians to after 2014 and the Revolution of Dignity, when they really made their split from Moscow's sphere of influence, to adopt the Ukrainian transliteration for the name of their cities and for them personally. And so Zelensky's name with the double Y at the end is a Ukrainian transliterated version of his name.
But you
yes,
you write it with 1 Y.
Mm-hmm. I do, and that's I think I still do that because if you're just a general reader, it might be difficult to understand why there are 2 Y's at the end of the name. I remember writing it with 2 Y's early on after I had started to cover him during his presidential campaign. And I think a lot of media very early adopted the 1 Y policy because it just looked a bit odd to English readers. But that is part of the complexity of the Ukrainian language and of course also the Russian language. And then I'll add one more slightly confusing thing, or at least at the time when I arrived here, which is after studying Russian for several months, and I arrived in eastern Ukraine, I found that a lot of people actually spoke Russian with a lot of Ukrainian mixed in and with a different accent. And this is something that was called surzhyk, which is a mix of the 2 languages. And it's very much more of an art than any sort of science. And some people will speak it, 90% Russian and 10% Ukrainian. Others maybe 80-20, which made it just a little bit more challenging to communicate with folks.
I thought that the 2 Y's were there because I kept on asking myself as I read about all of this, why? How soon after you arrived did you start tagging along with local journalists who were investigating stories? What were you doing at the time?
Yeah, my interest in that came about 1 year into my Peace Corps service. The first year I'd spent most of my time working at local schools. And then the second year, I wanted to branch out a little bit and work more with some of the community organizations that were not only in Artyomsk or Bakhmut, but also in other cities in the eastern region. And so I set out to the city of Donetsk, which is the regional capital of the eastern oblast there. And I met a couple of really interesting young journalists who were about my age and had founded an independent news website, which was something of a rarity here, because at the time, at least, much of the news organizations and especially television news were owned and operated by the country's powerful oligarchs. And so they rarely were independent. They typically reported on each other, and it was essentially they were essentially used as political tools. But these guys had this independent news outlet called Novosti Donbassa, or the News of the Donbass, which I found to be done in much more of a Western style. And so they offered me a chance to come down there and lecture local journalists on Western style of reporting, and a reporter for about 4 years in the Peace Corps. And then also to tag along with them. And so we went and spent some time with a group of miners working illegal coal mine there, trying to scrape out a living, eke out a living in these mines that were really not supposed to exist, but really part of this corrupt system that had been put in place by the then president, Viktor Yanukovych, and his family, who helped run some of the legitimate businesses that used coal from these illicit mines to sort of pad their books.
Now, okay, so your contract with the Peace Corps ended. Did you look for a job? How did you come to be offered a job at the Kyiv Post, which is an independent Ukrainian newspaper that's published in English? How many people read it?
Yeah, I had read it as a Peace Corps volunteer. It was, certainly one of the only English language media in the country, and one of the only English language media in the world that was regularly covering Ukraine. Most of the foreign correspondents that covered this part of the world were based in Moscow, and so that meant most of the reporting was about Russia rather than about Ukraine. So I took an interest in the Kyiv Post right away, and I thought about applying for a job at the Post before I finished the Peace Corps, but I held off. I wasn't sure that I actually wanted to stay here. I sort of struggled with that for a little while, and went and actually spent the summer of 2012 after I finished the Peace Corps in China, and I thought that I would maybe make a go of doing some journalism there, but that was a very naive thing to think, because I didn't have any language skills, and there was a giant learning curve. And so I ended up applying for a job as a reporter at the Kyiv Post, and because they were at the time pretty desperate for a native English speaker to help edit, they quickly invited me back to Ukraine to do some work for them, and by the start of 2013, I was their new reporter and news editor.
And you had moved to Kyiv. Now,
yeah.
Now, you say you were intent on reporting the truth about Yanukovych, the pro-Russian Ukrainian president, who you said earlier was corrupt. How corrupt was he?
Well, he stole billions and billions of dollars from state coffers. He had this system in place that really meant that nothing in the state could operate without corruption. He treated taxpayer money, government money as his own. He essentially took over a state compound about the size of Monaco and made it his own. Put these giant fences around it and wouldn't let anybody in. He created a helicopter pad. He built this giant log cabin mansion, and then a separate, slightly smaller palatial home that journalists would call Putin's house, because he had invited Vladimir Putin on a visit once to come and stay in it. He had an ostrich farm and a car museum of his own. It was, this really extravagant way of living, and yet on his official state salary, I think he was only pocketing officially maybe $30,000 to $40,000 a year. And so at the Kyiv Post, we at the time were one of the few independent organizations that didn't have to answer to an oligarch businessman owner. We were able to freely report on what we wanted. We had an American editor with decades of experience in American newspapers who oversaw the operation and guided us, through some very difficult stories. And we often broke some very big stories about corrupt ministers. And this was, my first real job as a foreign correspondent. And while there was a large learning curve, it really did help me to cut my teeth and really to understand not only how that type of journalism is done, but I think it was at that point that I really started to understand Ukraine as a place, and much more of the politics and government, certainly.
And weren't there protests when Yanukovych refused to sign a free trade agreement with the European Union? Was he being pressured by Putin, or was just that the way he saw things?
Yeah, it was a little bit of both. He was friendly with Putin, but he also flirted with the West and the European Union. A lot of I think there's this myth that Viktor Yanukovych was a Russian stooge from the very beginning, but I actually believe that while he was particularly friendly with Moscow, I think he was more self-interested than anything else, and saw potentially the signing of this association agreement with the European Union as a way to legitimize his stolen wealth and his close oligarch buddies' stolen wealth as well. So, for a time, many people in Ukraine and in the EU believed that he would actually go and sign this deal at a summit in Vilnius in November of 2013. When he didn't, it was a surprise, and he decided that instead of doing that, he would turn toward Russia and take a major bailout from Vladimir Putin, who was looking to create his own union, his own customs union with former Soviet republics. And people here came out to the streets peacefully with signs and protested his decision to turn eastward.
50,000 people chanting, "Ukraine is Europe."
Yeah. It was really remarkable and completely peaceful for the first several days. It only turned violent when Yanukovych ordered his security forces, called the Berkut, meaning the riot police here, to attack what was largely a group of university students. And I was there that night, and it was one of the most despicable things I'd ever witnessed. And my first time witnessing that type of violence, let alone state violence, and I remember seeing blood on the city square, and young teenagers screaming, photojournalists with huge gashes on their head, and these riot police just slugging away with their clubs at these peaceful protesters. And from that point on, it turned from a protest to a revolt, and soon a full-on revolution.
My guest on today's Leonard Lopate at Large is Christopher Miller, who's written a book called The War Came to Us, Life and Death in Ukraine. It's published by Bloomsbury. This is WBAI New York, 99.5 FM, and streaming live at WBAI.org. Were you surprised when Volodymyr Zelensky, who's a well-known comic actor, beat Petro Poroshenko in the presidential election of 2019?
I was surprised when he entered the race. I think we were all shocked here. I was less surprised by the second round of the election when he won. I think I was only a little bit surprised that he won by such a huge margin, by winning over 70% of the vote.
He's popular because he'd been on TV, right? Playing it.
Incredibly popular. Yeah. Oh, for years he was a popular stand-up comedian. He had voiced the Paddington Bear in the movies that were dubbed in Ukrainian over here. He had also produced this extremely popular show called Servant of the People, where he plays a history teacher who goes on a rant about corruption in the country and is accidentally or secretly filmed by a student who posts the video online. And it goes viral, and suddenly, overnight, he becomes president of Ukraine through this devious scheme that some oligarch has whipped up. And so, in very much the way that he became president in this popular TV show, Zelensky, the man, became president of Ukraine in real life. And, when he announced his candidacy for president, I think that's when people really began to believe that he had a real shot at this, because he was very much an outsider. Ukrainians really do like voting in, voting out incumbents and voting in fresh faces. There's only been one president in Ukraine's independent history since 1991 that served 2 terms. The rest have all been voted out. And so those of us here covering politics really did feel like he had a pretty good shot at it. And a few months later, in spring of 2019, he was elected overwhelmingly, and interestingly, on a platform of resolving the war and also stamping out corruption. Is
it your sense that people are happy with him, that he might be reelected?
People were really happy with him at first. The vast majority of people who voted for him, were pleased to vote out the incumbent Petro Poroshenko. They'd grown tired of him and liked the fact that Zelensky was inexperienced. Not totally unlike how some Americans felt about voting in Trump, wanting somebody with no prior political experience and an outsider, an entertainer. And he was very popular for, I would think, about his first year. And as Ukrainian presidents do, their popularity starts to wane. And by the time the full-scale invasion began in February of 2022, his popularity actually had plummeted from that 70% on which he was elected to just around 30%. People have grown tired of his failed efforts to clean up corruption and to not deliver on bringing peace and ending the war that had been ongoing since 2014, and they wanted some change.
Has he rebounded at all?
Yes. So, since Russia's invasion last year, his popularity again has skyrocketed. He's certainly
become a world figure.
Of course, he's the man of the moment. He made this incredibly difficult decision to not flee and to stay and fight, and very famously went out in front of his presidential administration and filmed this video that said, "I'm here, Yatut. I'm here. My office is here. My people are here. We want you to stay with us. We're going to fight this. Nobody is going to roll into Kiev and control us." And that really set the tone, I think, for Ukraine's defense. And still, he is this inspiring figure who is on the front lines almost once a week now with his soldiers. Very much a wartime leader. And I don't think that anybody could have imagined him being so. And that was one of the concerns when he was elected, that he may not do well as a commander in chief. But he's proven over the last year and a half in lobbying to foreign governments, particularly the United States, to provide billions of dollars of weapons to Ukraine. The UN, exactly. Yeah, there's almost nowhere he hasn't been. He pops up everywhere, whether it's in person at the Vilnius summit or in Washington speaking to Congress, or on video speaking to folks at the stock market. He's ubiquitous these days.
It does help that he speaks English.
His English has gotten a lot better, that's for sure. I remember meeting him as an actor before he had entered politics, and he couldn't really speak English. We spoke in Russian at the time, and even then his Ukrainian wasn't even very strong. So he's worked on both, and that's definitely helped him connect not only with his people here, but also with the West.
How different is Ukrainian from Russian? They grow out of the same languages, don't they? The same roots?
Same but different. No, they are two separate languages. I think, very generally speaking, I guess you could say that Ukrainian is perhaps even more similar to Belarusian than to Russian. Maybe even in many ways more similar to Polish than Russian. There are enough similarities that I can tell you as a non-native Russian and non-native Ukrainian speaker that I can understand folks when they are speaking to me in either language. But when it is Ukrainian, if it's a more complex conversation that we're having and not out and about doing daily tasks, I'll struggle to understand what they're saying to me, because Ukrainian is a separate language from Russian. It's just one that I think much of the world hasn't really thought about or known about or heard of, because it's been suppressed or oppressed by Russia for decades and decades. And
part of the Soviet Union.
A language. Yes, exactly. Part of when it was part of the Soviet Union. Vladimir Lenin didn't believe that Ukrainians in Ukraine was a real place. And that's part of Putin's message now, that Ukraine was a place that was contrived and created by Vladimir Lenin, that it didn't exist before the Soviet Union, that Ukrainians are Russians who've lost their way, and that they're not a real people, that they don't have their own culture and they don't have their own language. And of course, that's false.
Well, Russia started in Kiev, didn't it?
Yeah, the birthplace of Russia and the birthplace of Ukraine and Slavic culture is right here where I'm speaking to you from, in Kiev. This is where Kievan Rus was born in the late 1900s. And the Ukrainians like to remind the Russians that by saying that when Kievan Rus was founded here in Kiev, Moscow was still a forest. There wasn't anything developed there yet.
Now, you split your time between Kiev and Brooklyn, but we're talking to you from Kiev. What time is it right now?
It's a long commute. It's almost 8:30 p.m. in Kiev.
Tonight, hour to 8:30.
Tonight, yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Now, you've traveled all over Ukraine to the covered steppe of the Donbass in the Far East, the Euromaidan revolution camp in Kyiv, the shores of the Black Sea in Crimea, to battlefields in places like Busha, Bakhmut, and bombed-out Mariupol. Did you go all of those places on assignments?
Yeah, I've been to many of those places on assignments, and other places, and some of them also before the war, just to travel and to get a better sense of the country and its people. Before the war began in 2014, when I was a Peace Corps volunteer, I had more than 2 years to really just set out and explore Ukraine, and I spent a lot of time on trains. I think I counted more than 100 just in the first 2 years that I was here. That took me from Donetsk to Crimea, Odessa, Kiev, Lviv. So that would be north, south, east, west, mountains, forests, plains.
Very different look, like the United States.
Yeah, the really great thing about Ukraine is that in being as big as it is, and also having a sea border, you get a lot of different climates, and the geography changes from region to region. So where I lived in Bakhmut in eastern Ukraine, you get these really wide open sprawling steppes that are covered in these beautiful fields of golden sunflowers. And this time of year right now, they're all blooming. And it's just absolutely stunning. And if it weren't for the war, it would be just this really peaceful, beautiful place to ride your bike through, like I used to do. I used to crisscross that whole eastern steppe on my bicycle. That region is also covered in what they call terrakon, or slag heaps from the mine waste. Many of them are now decades old, and so they've been covered with shrubbery and trees, and they look a bit like mountains. And so a lot of folks out there joke that they're the Carpathians of the East. And the Carpathians, of course, are the actual beautiful, really beautiful, stunning mountains in Western Ukraine, where I've also spent some time. And it's just a really stunning place.
Well, important years in the history of Ukraine, because while you've been working there, you've witnessed some of the country's most traumatic and transformative recent events: the 2013 Euromaidan protest movement, Russia's annexation of Crimea, the war between Ukraine and Russia in Donetsk in 2014, Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, and the war that's followed that.
Yeah.
Wow.
I certainly didn't set out to cover any of those. I ended up being here when they all happened, when they began, when the revolution was sparked by the violence that we mentioned earlier. When Russian troops rolled into Crimea after Ukraine's pro-Russian president was ousted in February of 2014, and then also when the war broke out in eastern Ukraine, where I used to live. It made sense for me to go back and cover it. I knew the geography. I knew the people. I actually knew a lot of Ukrainians who were then, at that point, taking up arms and fighting on both sides. It was, I guess I don't like to use the word, fortunate or lucky, but I was certainly in the right place at the right time, as a journalist to cover these things, and not just as somebody who was parachuting in from say another war zone or conflict-ridden country, but in a place that I knew very deeply, because I'd never set out to actually be a war correspondent, and I still don't use that term in describing myself. I'm very much a reporter, or a writer. I take some fairly decent photos from time to time, but I was very happy writing about politics and culture here, and then all of these, I mean, massive events unfolded, and I learned one day at a time how to cover them, how to keep myself safe, how to keep my fellow journalists working alongside me safe, how to be a reporter in wartime rather than be a war correspondent.
But can it be confusing at times? Some of these places have had a number of different names over the years. Donetsk has been Alexandrovka, Yuzivka, Stalin, and Stalino.
Well, they haven't been in
place.
all of those in my lifetime, though. So I've got the benefit of knowing Donetsk as just Donetsk, and studying the rest of them as in my personal time as someone who's interested in their history. But more recently, since Ukraine set on this path of decommunization in 2016, I mean, really since since its independence in 1991, but really imposing these new decommunization laws and pushing ahead with them after 2016. A lot of places have changed names. Streets have changed names. That's been maybe one of the most confusing things is saying, we need to travel down this road, or the only place to get to this area of the front line or that checkpoint is to go down this road, and somebody else will know it by its old name and I'll know it by its new name. So it can be confusing at times, but I do think I have developed a knack for actually remembering the history of a lot of really small off the beaten path places here. And maybe that's just because before the war began, I had a lot of time on my hands, especially in my Peace Corps time here, and there wasn't much else to do but to explore and to read and to talk to people.
You're listening to Leonard Lopate at Large on WBAI New York 99.5 FM and streaming live at WBAI.org. I hope you're enjoying my conversation with Christopher Miller. If you sign up to become a member of WBAI during today's show with a contribution of $50 or more, you can receive a free copy of the book we've been discussing, his book, The War Came to Us. Just go online to give2wbai.org or call 212-209-2950 during today's show, and we'll be happy to send you a copy. That's give and the number 2, WBAI.org, or 212-209-2950. But don't forget to make that $50 or more donation in the name of Leonard Lopate at Large, and we thank you very much. And return now to Christopher Miller to discuss his book, The War Came to Us, The Life and Death in Ukraine, from Bloomsbury. Now, Crimea is something that has come up a bit in our conversation. Had Nikita Khrushchev given Crimea to Ukraine in 1954 as a goodwill gesture?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, Khrushchev essentially gifted Crimea to Ukraine, and it was a goodwill gesture. And certainly at the time, there was no thinking that the Soviet Union was going to collapse. Just a few decades later, the idea was that nothing really would change in practice, that it would continue to be a part of the Soviet Union. And so, many people at the fall of the Soviet Union felt, at least in Russia, that it would remain a part of Russia rather than Ukraine. But because it had been gifted to Ukraine and formally was a part of Soviet Ukraine, it stayed with independent Ukraine after the collapse. And so that was one reason one justification that Putin made for invading and annexing Crimea was that it needed to be returned to its historical place, which he believes is Russia. But of course, it was even before it was part of Russia or Ukraine or the Soviet Union. It was ruled by Tatars and other civilizations even before that. Many people have conquered Crimea, and so I think it's very much a difficult place when thinking about where exactly it belongs historically. But there is no doubt that at least under international law currently, it's very much a part of Ukraine, and Ukraine is very focused on returning not only the mainland of its country that is under Russian occupation right now, but also all of Crimea, which has been occupied since 2014.
And you were in Ukraine when Vladimir Putin took it back in 2014. How did the locals react to that? And what about people across Ukraine, which is a very large country with a number of different languages?
Yeah, I was actually in Crimea when the Russian soldiers without insignia slipped off of their naval base and spilled into the cities of Sevastopol and Simferopol and Bakhchisarai and all these other cities on the Crimean Peninsula and took over essentially without firing a shot even. The Ukrainian military was shocked. They were not ready for this. They had been essentially taken apart over decades. Very little money was put into the Ukrainian military. They never thought that they would have to fight a war again, let alone with their neighbor, Russia. And so they were caught very much off guard by these Russian soldiers who actually were there under a contract that had been signed and agreed by Kiev and Moscow that said that up to 25,000 Russian soldiers could be there as part of Russia's Black Sea Fleet in Sevastopol. And so they were already there, making the invasion very, very easy for them, which is why we woke up one morning and they were already storming Parliament and other local government buildings and had taken over the peninsula essentially by sundown on the first day. And so when I arrived, these men who were without insignia and not speaking were everywhere. They were posing for photographs. Many of the people in Crimea welcomed them. It's no secret that there are many people in Crimea with a strong affinity for Moscow and felt as though life under Russian rule would be better. Pensioners in particular, retirees who thought that they would get better pensions under Russian rule than they were getting under Ukrainian rule.
Has that happened?
No, it didn't happen. I think the people of Crimea who supported Russia's annexation have many of them have now found that they were lied to and things didn't work out as well as they had hoped. And in fact, the peninsula has largely been cut off from the global economy. Credit cards don't work there. There's special credit cards that you have to use for the first year or two. It was mostly a cash economy. Travel to Ukraine to visit relatives was almost impossible. Even traveling to Russia was very difficult, because there was no mainland route. You had to take a ferry at that time before Russia erected this illegal Crimea bridge that now has been in the news because the Ukrainians have struck it with missiles. It did not go according to plan for many people.
And you also witnessed a battle between Ukrainian soldiers and Russian separatists for Donetsk airport in 2014. Was that a major scoop for you?
I think, I think many journalists were out in Donetsk in eastern Ukraine at the time, covering what was certainly shaping up to be a real war. But at the time, there had been some small skirmishes, and this airport battle really marked the start of the war in eastern Ukraine. It was violence on a scale that I had not witnessed ever before. I was trailing a group of Russian fighters who had light and medium weight weaponry. They were carrying anti-tank missiles and rocket-propelled grenades. They had Kalashnikov rifles and large caliber machine guns. And the Ukrainians were trying to fight them back from the airport terminal using attack helicopters and other similar weapons of their own. And it was a real bloodbath. And there were dozens of people who were injured and killed, and civilians as well, some nearby who were killed by stray bullets. It was It was really terrible, and I think that was the day that really marked the start of the war in 2014, and that would continue on much in a similar way, if not, well, and on many occasions, it would get much worse before there was ever this ceasefire in February of 2015.
Should we have been aware that the seeds of Russia's war against Ukraine in the West had been sown more than a decade earlier?
Yeah, I think so. There's definitely an argument to be made that the West was just not paying close enough attention. Russia invaded Georgia in 2008, and I think, especially here among Ukrainians, there are many people who believe that should have really set off alarms for leaders in the West, especially those in NATO and the United States, that Russia had designs on many former Soviet republics, that Georgia was perhaps just a testing ground, and that Ukraine could very well be next. And certainly, there were signs that were either missed or ignored. And when Crimea happened, I think that really caught a lot of people off guard. And as I mentioned in my book, when Russian soldiers showed up in Crimea, the acting Ukrainian president, Alexander Turchinov, made a call to Washington to speak with the Obama administration and the president himself. And he recounted to me how the White House told him to stand down, not to respond, because they didn't know what would happen, and they feared that would unleash a greater Russian military fury.
My guest today is Christopher Miller, who's written a book called The War Came to Us, Life and Death in Ukraine, published by Bloomsbury. This is WBAI New York, 99.5 FM, and streaming live at WBAI.org. How dangerous was this for you? After the war broke out, didn't you travel under enemy fire to the cities of Mariupol and Bakhmut? And didn't you have to hide in the basements of damaged buildings during drone attacks?
Yeah, everything is done with having made some calculations. There are risks that, as a journalist, I think I need to be willing to take, but they are calculated risks. Still nothing is 100% safe, and with the weaponry that's being used on the battlefields out here, our artillery systems, for example, that are rather indiscriminate. You never know where a shell is going to come exploding down, and oftentimes that does happen in places that are a little too close for comfort. And I've been caught in some artillery attacks, and it's a deeply unpleasant experience. But we do run to shelters when we can find them, basements, sometimes vegetable cellars underground, anywhere really to get out of the way of incoming fire. But sometimes you can't, and you just simply need to drop to the ground, lay flat, wait it out, and cross your fingers. But these are calculations that I make, that other correspondents make as well, in order to get to these places where we can interview people, civilians caught in the crossfire, soldiers who are defending their country, in order to tell the stories of this.
Well, didn't a man tell you he was going to kill you unless you confessed to being an American spy?
That happened on several occasions, unfortunately, yes. I think in at least his case, I'm glad that obviously that did not happen. But I think it was an intimidation tactic. It was a way to try to get me to flinch and to turn around and not enter the Russian occupied city that I was trying to enter, and in hopes that I would just leave and not go in and talk to people. This is a war of bullets, but it's also a war of information, and the Russians really do not want Western journalists to be in territories under their control, to tell stories from those places, to talk to their soldiers, to talk to civilians under their occupation, because we know what's happening there, from the few people that we have managed to speak to, and those that have who have escaped, who have recounted stories of torture and horrific abuse and murder. We have seen after Ukraine liberates towns and cities, the mass graves that are left behind, and it's terrible. So I have been told that more than once, as I said, but I think again it's just a matter of trying to gauge whether the person is serious or not, or if this really is a threat, or if it's simply an attempt at intimidating a journalist so that they won't be able to tell this story.
But you've also interviewed many of the key figures in this story. Did it help or hinder that you were an American?
I do think as an American, it provides me a sort of distance in a way that a Russian journalist or a Ukrainian journalist won't have necessarily in covering this. Even as somebody who's now deeply tied to this country and has spent a lot of time here and seen friends grow up and get married and build lives for themselves here, and considers this his second home, I think I'm still I have a little bit of distance between me and the story, and I think that has helped at times to be able to tell a more complex story, certainly to get access to people and the sides of this war that aren't available to Ukrainian journalists or Russian journalists. Certainly now it's impossible for either of them to come over and report on either side. It's more difficult. It's difficult, obviously, for Americans to report on the Russian side now, and we have a colleague who's been jailed in Russia for reporting over there. But still, I think being a foreign correspondent has its benefits. That said, I would also point out that there are challenges as well. One being the language issue, which I don't have a huge problem with at the moment, but I'm still not a fluent Russian, and certainly not a fluent Ukrainian speaker. But also there's just an inherent knowledge, if you're a Ukrainian, that goes a long way to being able to comprehend what is happening.
Donald Trump's legal issues have been dominating the news recently in this country. He only appears at the end of your book in relation to the Hunter Biden story. Was he somebody who was discussed much while you were there?
Yeah, I covered, Trump has a way of sucking up all of the oxygen in the room, and I made a point not to discuss him and the impact that he's had over here in the scandal in 2019 when he threatened to withhold crucial military aid unless President Zelensky opened a criminal investigation into then candidate Joe Biden.
I heard he was insisting on all of his food being made with Putinesca.
Something like that. But yeah, I didn't want this to be a book about Trump, and I didn't want it to be a book that focused much on global politics and the foreign politicians who are playing major roles in this. I really wanted it to be a book that was written from ground level, that gave great insight into the place and the people and the culture, and really just shared these stories of incredible people doing things that are just extraordinary. And I felt that focusing more on Trump and the scandal of a few years back would maybe be more of a distraction than a benefit in this book.
And you couldn't have known when you were writing the book that Russia would then do everything possible to end Ukrainian grain exports, but the whole world is affected by that. Is that something that's being discussed in Ukraine?
Absolutely. It's one of the major concerns of Kiev, of President Zelensky. His foreign minister, Dmitry Kuleba, is reaching out now to the global south, to Asian countries, to try to get them to essentially side with Ukraine and use whatever leverage they have against Russia to try to get it to come back to this grain deal that was brokered by the United Nations to export grain from Ukrainian ports. Since Russia backed out of this deal a couple of weeks ago, it has spent countless. Well, let's see. It hit first the seaports in Odessa, I believe, five nights in a row, destroying grain elevators and infrastructure at the ports. Just yesterday, or this week, Russian missiles, or drones rather, struck another port just a few hundred feet from the Romanian border, really close to EU and NATO territory. And so it's backed out of this deal. It's destroying all of this infrastructure to export, used to export grain, and that's going to have a devastating effect on food supplies across the world. But of course, this is one of the tactics that Russia is employing now because it hasn't had military success on the battlefield here.
And he has to be very concerned about accidentally crossing over into NATO territory. The area is surrounded by members of NATO now.
For sure.
Are you concerned that we might wind up seeing something the equivalent of a world war coming out of all of this?
I mean, that remains a concern, not only of mine, certainly of people with a lot more power than myself. But I think when you see a drone strike on one side of a river that you could essentially swim across, and that being the difference between a NATO Article 5, which would mean that the military bloc has to respond militarily, and not, then yeah, I mean, it feels like we're in a really, really dangerous moment, and it could get a lot worse yet, and I really hope that it doesn't. But I think Vladimir Putin is backed into a corner. He's not had a military that's performed very well on the battlefield. They haven't had a military success really besides occupying Bakhmut, but only after 10 months of destroying the city.
Should we be surprised? Because we always thought that Russia was one of the most powerful countries in the world.
Yeah, I mean, certainly that was the concern of Washington and Brussels and just about every other Western nation ahead of the full-scale invasion in February of 2022. That's why the warnings were, to President Zelensky and the Ukrainians, you need to prepare, you need to do everything you can now. If there's any way you can speak to the Kremlin and negotiate some kind of deal to stop them from doing this, you should, because everybody in the world believed that the Russian military was the second most powerful military there was. And I think, the Russians certainly believed that, and so much so that they were very unprepared for this invasion. Instead, they rolled across the border rather easy, but then very quickly made mistake after mistake after mistake against a country with a much, much smaller military, and at the time, one that was not armed with the billions and billions of dollars of Western weaponry that it now is.
Thank you so much for being on our show. Since 2022, Christopher Miller has been the lead correspondent in Ukraine for the Financial Times. Previously, he worked as a world and national security reporter for Politico, as a senior world correspondent for BuzzFeed News, and a correspondent for Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty in Kyiv. His book, The War Came to Us, Life and Death in Ukraine, is published by Bloomsbury, and I thank you so much for being on our show today.
It was a pleasure. Thank you for having me on.
And that brings us to the end of our show. If you're just discovering this program and would like to hear more about 1 hour deep dive interviews, you can access our over 800 past shows streaming on demand at WBAI.org. Our podcast, which has surpassed by a lot 1 million plays, is available on iTunes, Apple, and everywhere else you get your podcasts. And if you'd like to write to me, my email address is leonardlopate@wbai.org. Before I sign off today, I need to ask you to support WBAI. We're going through a rough time ourselves, and we're hoping that you'll make a contribution at whatever level you're comfortable with to help us get through these rough times. Do that by calling 212-209-2950 or by going online to give2wbai.org right now. That's 212-209-2950 or give and the number 2wbai.org. We need your help to keep bringing you this unique, in-depth content, information you usually don't get anywhere else. And as I mentioned earlier, anyone who makes a contribution of $50 or more in the name of Leonard Lopate at Large right now can receive a copy of the book we've been discussing, The War Came to Us by Christopher Miller. So make that call right now, 212-209-2950. Go online to give2wbai.org. And you might also consider becoming a sustaining member, what we call a BAI buddy, for $10, $15, $20, $25 a month, as long as you wish. And it allows us to plan for the future, and we'll say thank you with a BAI tote bag to anyone who signs up to become a BAI buddy for $10 a month or more. Please do it. We're the only station in the New York radio dial that's 100% listener-sponsored. Your contribution is tax deductible. And we hope you can join us again tomorrow when my guest, Robert L. Oken, will discuss Silent Voices, his updated book about people with mental disorders on the street. We'll see you then.
Christina Onnested. Donald Trump is set to appear in federal court in Washington, D.C. today on federal felony charges. He sought to overturn his 2020 presidential election loss. The Republican former president will be facing a judge near the U.S. Capitol building his supporters stormed to try to block the peaceful transfer of power to Democrat Joe Biden. Trump's expected to be taken into custody, processed, and enter a non-guilty plea in front of a judge before being released. Then he'll rejoin the 2024 campaign trail as he seeks to reclaim the White House. The federal judge assigned to Trump's election fraud case was appointed by former President Barack Obama and has levied some of the harshest sentences on 38 people convicted for participating in the deadly Capitol siege, often handing down harsher prison sentences than what Justice Department prosecutors recommended. Judge Tanya Chutkin has sentenced 38 convicted people anywhere from 10 days to 5 years. She's a former assistant public defender. Meanwhile, the response to Trump's indictment has been mixed. Vice President Mike Pence, who's at the center of the indictment and the alleged scheme to overturn Trump's election loss, have spoken out. Christopher Martinez reports.
One part of the indictment describes Trump criticizing then Vice President Mike Pence for not throwing out votes from certain states. According to the indictment, Trump told Pence, "You're too honest." As for Pence himself, he says he had hoped it would not come to an indictment.
Irrespective of the indictment, I want the American people to know that I had no right to overturn the election. And then on that day, President Trump asked me to put him over the Constitution. But I chose the Constitution, and I always will. I really do believe that anyone who puts himself over the Constitution should never be President of the United States. And anyone who asks someone else to put themselves over the Constitution should never be President of the United States again.
He emphasized that point about not having a right to not count votes, as Trump had asked him to do.
Sadly, the president was surrounded by a group of crackpot lawyers that kept telling him what his itching ears wanted to hear.
I'm Christopher Martinez.
The gunman who carried out the deadliest anti-Semitic attack in U.S. history will likely be sentenced to death today after a jury Wednesday recommended the death penalty for Robert Bowers. He was found guilty in June of storming into the Tree of Life synagogue in Pittsburgh and opening fire on congregants, killing 11 of them. The 50-year-old truck driver had spewed hatred of Jews and espoused white supremacist beliefs online before carrying out the 2018 massacre at the Tree of Life synagogue. A judge will formally sentence him today after victims, loved ones, and survivors give impact statements. Most of the victims were elderly or disabled. Bowers also wounded 2 worshipers and 5 police officers in the shooting. A rabbi who helped hide congregants at the Tree of Life the day of the shooting has urged Bowers' life be spared, and he's sent to life in prison. Jonathan Perlman told the Jewish publication Forward, "Revenge will not bring our slain loved ones back to life, and seeking it may even hurt ourselves and extend our sadness, he said. Wisconsin Democrats are celebrating the beginning of a new era for the state Supreme Court as it flips from conservative to Democratic control. Janet Protasewicz made abortion rights a focus of her winning election campaign and was sworn into a 10-year term Tuesday. Catherine Carley reports.
For the first time in 15 years, Wisconsin Democrats are celebrating liberal control of the state Supreme Court following the swearing in of Judge Janet Protasewicz.
Well, Wisconsin, guess what? We did it! We did it!
Protasewicz called Republican-drawn legislative maps rigged. A lawsuit asking the court to rule the maps as unconstitutional has already been filed by law firms and voting rights groups. I'm Catherine Carley for Pacifica Network and Public News Service.
Greenpeace activists have scaled the country home of British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak and draped a side of it in black fabric to protest the expansion of oil drilling in the North Sea. Video posted by the group today shows activists with a yellow banner on the roof that says no new oil and also